There are trades that shock you because of the timing, and then there are trades that don't shock you at all. They just confirm something you felt for a long time. This one didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived honestly. Tonight, Trae Young is a Washington Wizard. And before we talk about Washington, or fit, or timelines, or what this means for the Eastern Conference, we have to slow this moment down. Because trades like this aren't about movement. They're about admission. Atlanta didn't wake up today and decide Trae Young wasn't good enough. They woke up realizing they'd run out of ways to explain why things never quite worked. Because for years, Atlanta lived in the space between belief and doubt. Between this is our guy and is this really sustainable? Between committing to a vision and quietly hedging against it. And when organizations live there too long, the ending usually sounds like this. It just didn't fit. But that phrase hides a lot. Trae Young arrived in Atlanta carrying more than just expectations. He carried identity. He carried relevance. He carried the responsibility of dragging a franchise back into the national conversation. And he did that almost immediately. There was a noise, the range, the audacity, the nights where the building buzzed because something unpredictable might happen. And then there was that run. An Eastern Conference Finals appearance that felt like a breakthrough and functioned like a shortcut. One of those moments the league hands you early, not as a promise, but as a question. Atlanta treated it like an answer. Instead of asking why that run worked, the matchups, the timing, the looseness, they treated it like a baseline, like proof that the timeline was ahead of schedule and the rest would naturally follow. And it didn't. Because what followed was drift. Coaching changes that reset voices but not philosophy. Roster tweaks that chased balance without defining identity. A constant attempt to make Trae smaller instead of making the system clearer. Defense first pivots, secondary ball handlers, wings who fit on paper but not in rhythm. And through all of it, Trae stayed the same player, but the expectations around him kept shifting. Some nights he was supposed to be the engine, other nights the release valve. Sometimes he was supposed to be the villain. Sometimes he was supposed to be the scapegoat. That's a hard way to build anything stable, because Trae Young is not ambiguous. He never has been. He's a high-usage, high-gravity guard who bends defenses and demands structure. He amplifies strengths, and he exposes uncertainty when the vision is clear. He looks electric. When it's not, everything feels loud and fragile. Atlanta never fully chose one direction. They wanted his creativity without the chaos, the offense without the concessions, the star without the inconvenience of committing to his ecosystem. So instead of clarity, they lived with tension, and tension eventually forces decisions. This trade isn't an indictment of Trae Young as a player. It's a reflection of an organization that couldn't decide whether it was building around him or through him. Those are very different things. Building around him requires patience, spacing, and acceptance that the offense will tilt heavily in one direction. Building through him requires trust and continuity, not constant course correction. Atlanta kept trying to do both, and when teams do that, the story always ends the same way. Not with anger, not with collapse, but with exhaustion. So today wasn't about Washington stealing a star. It was about Atlanta acknowledging that the relationship had reached a point where neither side was becoming better together. And that matters, not because of blame, but because of honesty. Because now Trae Young walks into a situation where the expectations are reset, but they're not removed. Washington isn't a finished project. It isn't a contender. It's a bet. A bet that says we know exactly what this player is and we're willing to build accordingly. That doesn't mean that success is guaranteed. It means that the terms are clear. There's no Eastern Conference Finals glow to live up to. No illusion of being ahead of schedule, no pressure to pretend the window is already open. just responsibility. Responsibility for Trae to grow beyond being the offense and into being the leader of one. Responsibility for Washington to provide structure instead of slogans. Responsibility for both sides to stop chasing shortcuts. This trade didn't erase Trae Young's Atlanta chapter. It closed it at the moment pretending became harder than moving forward. And that's not failure. That's a reset that finally tells the truth. Washington didn't make this trade because they're close. They made it because they're tired of floating. For years, the Wizards have lived in a familiar NBA purgatory. Not bad enough to bottom out, cleanly not good enough to matter. A franchise stuck confusing activity for direction, motion for momentum. This trade isn't Washington saying that they're ready, it's Washington saying that they're choosing something. And that distinction matters. Because Trae Young doesn't arrive in Washington as a savior. He arrives as a commitment, a declaration that the franchise is finally willing to let its identity tilt instead of pretending balance will magically appear on its own. And that's a risk. Trae Young forces honesty. He forces you to answer questions you can usually delay. Who has the ball when it matters? What pace do we live at? Are we building to compete or just to survive the schedule? Washington hasn't had to answer those cleanly in a long time. And now they do. This isn't a franchise saying we're one piece away. It's a franchise saying we're tired of being undefined. Trae doesn't solve that by himself, but he exposes whether you're serious about trying. Because if you bring in a player like Trae Young and still don't commit to structure, spacing, and purpose, the failure won't be subtle. It'll be loud, immediate, and public. That's the bet Washington just placed. They're betting that clarity is worth the risk. That choosing a direction, even a volatile one, is better than just drifting. And that's not something that you do lightly, because this version of Trae Young arrives with fewer excuses attached. He's no longer the young star learning on the fly. No longer the upstart antagonist playing spoiler in someone else's building. He's no longer protected by timeline optimism. He's experienced. He's been blamed. He's been celebrated and dismissed, sometimes in the same sentence. Which means this chapter isn't about discovery. It's about definition. Washington doesn't need Trae to be everything. They need him to be clear. Clear about leadership, clear about tone, clear about what winning basketball looks like when things aren't going well. And Trae hasn't always been asked to carry that part of the load. In Atlanta, he carried offense. In Washington, he carries direction. That's heavier. Because direction doesn't show up in box scores. It shows up in how teams respond after losses, and how young players settle instead of scatter, and whether habits form or crumble under pressure. This is where Trae's reputation actually evolves. Not with a shot, not with a logo 3, but with restraint, with trust, with nights where the game doesn't need him to be spectacular, just steady. Washington is betting that he's ready for that. And Trae is betting that an organization willing to stop pretending is finally worth leaning into. That doesn't mean that it'll work, but it means that it's real. And in this league, reality is rarer than talent, because plenty of teams have stars, but very few have alignment. This trade isn't a shortcut to contention. It's a long walk towards coherence. And whether Washington gets there won't depend on Trae's highlights. It'll depend on whether the franchise resets the urge to panic the first time that things look uncomfortable. Because that's the test now. Not whether Trae can score, not whether the Wizards can sell jerseys, but whether both sides can sit in the discomfort of building something that doesn't resolve itself overnight. Atlanta ran from that moment. Washington just stepped into it. And Trae Young is standing right in the middle. No longer the future, but not yet the answer. But finally, the questions both sides are willing to ask out loud. This is the part of the story that doesn't belong to Atlanta. And it doesn't belong to Washington either. It belongs to Trae Young. Because when stars change teams early, the league frames it as discovery. When they change teams late, it's framed as desperation. But this move lives in the uncomfortable middle, where potential has already been tested and reputation has already been hardened. Trae Young isn't being traded to find out who he is. He's being traded to decide who he's going to be. Up till now, his career has been defined by gravity, defensive attention, offensive burden, the constant hum of responsibility that comes with being small, brilliant, and unavoidable. But gravity alone doesn't shape careers, it reveals them. And what this next chapter demands from Trae isn't louder confidence or bigger moments. It demands discernment. Because in Washington, there's no illusion of immediate contention to hide behind. No veteran core ready to absorb all the pressure. No expectations cushioned by playoff inevitability. This is a room that will look to him, not for fireworks, but for order. And that's different. Atlanta needed Trae to bend games. Washington needs him to organize them. That's a harder skill to learn than scoring. Because leadership at this stage doesn't announce itself. It shows up in possessions that don't end with his hands. In tempo choices. In knowing when the offense needs calming instead of ignition. This is where great guards separate from electric ones. Trae has always been willing to take the responsibility. What he hasn't always been asked to do is share it, genuinely, without disappearing. That's the balance now. Because Washington doesn't need Trae to be quieter. They need him to be intentional. They need him to understand that control isn't dominance, it's trust. That leadership doesn't mean carrying every moment. It means deciding which moments need carried at all. That's not something film sessions teach early or easily. That's something time teaches. And this trade accelerates that lesson. There's also no hiding from the narrative anymore. In Atlanta, there was always one more layer of context. The roster never fit, the defense never held, the coaching never stabilized. All of those things were true, but they also acted as insulation. In Washington, the insulation is gone. This chapter won't be judged by upside or flashes. It will be judged by tone, by whether young players improve, by whether losses feel instructional instead of deflating, by whether the same mistakes repeat or they get corrected. That's the real measurement now. And this isn't punishment, it's evolution. Because Trae Young has spent years being discussed instead of understood. Loved and doubted in equal measure. Celebrated for audacity and questioned for sustainability. This is the first time his environment and his moment align in a way that removes the noise. No shortcuts, no false timelines. No pretending the window is already open. Just the work of becoming the kind of player whose impact survives context. That's not about rings yet. That's about credibility. And credibility is built slowly, especially for guards like Trae, whose greatness has always been obvious, but whose influence has been harder to quantify. This trade doesn't promise redemption. It offers responsibility without illusion. And whether Trae embraces that fully, whether he grows from centerpiece to compass, will define not just how this trade is remembered, but how his entire career is eventually understood. Not as a star who needed saving, but as a leader who learned when to stop trying to bend everything and started learning how to hold things together. We talk a lot about new beginnings like they're clean. New job, new city, new role. We like to imagine a fresh start as a reset. like the past disappears the moment you change environments. But anyone who's actually lived through change knows that that's not how it works. You don't start over. You carry things with you. Trae Young didn't arrive in Washington as a veteran stepping into a finished house. This isn't the late career move where the walls are already up and the expectations are clearly labeled. This feels closer to starting a new job where the title is impressive, but the instructions are vague. A room that looks to you for answers before it's fully decided what the question even is. That's a lot to put on someone who's already spent years being the solution to problems he never created. And that's where the discomfort lives. Because Washington didn't trade for Trae to complement something established. They traded for him to define something that isn't yet formed, to bring coherence to a place still figuring out its shape. That's not relief. That's pressure in different clothes. And for Trae, that pressure isn't unfamiliar, but it's revealing. Because this move doesn't simplify his responsibilities. It reframes them. It asks him to lead without a safety net, to guide without guarantees, to believe in a direction that's still being drawn. That's not an ideal situation, but growth rarely is. Atlanta reached a point where pretending became heavier than change. Washington is now stepping into the opposite risk, choosing change before stability exists. And Trae is standing between those two realities. Not as a savior, not as a finished product, but as someone still learning that leadership isn't just about what you can do, it's about what you're willing to build without certainty. And that's a familiar feeling. A lot of us know what it's like to step into a new role where expectations arrive before the support, where people assume competence means answers, where the job description expands faster than the resources around you. And sometimes, the win is an immediate success. Sometimes it's surviving the ambiguity without losing yourself. This trade won't be remembered by its announcement. It'll be remembered by how patient Washington stays when things look unfinished, and how Trae responds when the environment asks him to be more than spectacular. New beginnings aren't about comfort. They're about honesty. And this one is honest in a way that feels uncomfortable on purpose. Because if it works, it won't be because Trae found the perfect home. It'll be because he helped build one, brick by brick, without pretending that it was already there. I'm Vincent Cooper. This was Round Ball Rants. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and remember, it's not just basketball. It's therapy with a bounce.